State Prison, Attica, New York. Its massive gray walls stand as a monument to the control of men and to the loss of control. When it opened 70 years ago, Attica was hailed as an architectural landmark, a model for the humane confinement of the state's most dangerous criminals. Over time, its name became a battle cry that still echoes with the sound of death, despair, and violence.
You can get stabbed over a pair of sneakers. You get stabbed because you was looking at a guy the wrong way.
Through the years, Attica has housed such notorious offenders as bank robber Willie the Actor Sutton, serial killer David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam, and Mark David Chapman, the troubled youth whose personal demons and delusions led him to murder John Lennon. But Attica is best known as the scene of the worst prison riot in history, the bloodiest one-day fight between Americans since the Civil War.
It was horrible. It was horrible. It was more like a nightmare.
Do not harm the hostages.
The bottom line, I was scared to death. I was scared to death.
But despite all the problems, Attica's staff has always maintained their good intentions and struggled to strike a balance between reform and retribution, between punishment and brutality, between humanity and maximum security. The story of Attica Penitentiary begins in 1926. A time when the rapid growth in New York's population created a demand for more and more prison cells. The state's 4 existing prisons were severely out of date and desperately crowded. Auburn, completed in 1816, was the oldest. Sing Sing had followed in 1825, and Clinton Penitentiary in 1844. New York's youngest penal institution, Great Meadow Prison, had opened its doors in 1911. All shared the disturbing features of primitive American prisons. They had been built with no electricity and no plumbing. It was an era when inmates used one bucket for the toilet and another for fresh water. The aging prisons had been designed to facilitate a 19th century penal philosophy of forced silence and hard labor, a system that often did more to drive men insane than bring about their reform. New York's leaders proposed a new and modern facility to ease the harsh conditions and crowding. The site chosen was a tiny village in western New York named after a city in ancient Greece, Attica. The town was selected in part because its proximity to railroad lines would make it easy to transport prisoners. There was also a ready water supply from 3 reservoirs owned by the city. On October 15, 1929, an impromptu crowd of 50 Attica residents gathered at the site of the new prison and watched as the first shovel of dirt was turned by Mayor Fred Hetler. The plans called for 4 cell blocks, an administration building, a hospital, dining rooms, a kitchen, and countless other structures necessary to sustain a population of 2,000 inmates and hundreds of guards and employees. 7,500 feet of gray cement wall would also be constructed to enclose the 50-acre penitentiary. But shortly after digging began, a serious problem arose.
The back wall and the back corner over on that side had a lot of quicksand in it, and they'd lose trucks. The whole truck would go down.
The quicksand issue was soon announced to local residents by heavy hammering that shook doors and windows for miles around. It was the sound of gigantic 85-foot-long shafts of lumber being pounded into the ground to provide a solid footing for the mammoth prison wall. Concerns were raised about the vulnerability of citizens living near a prison whose structure might fall away, freeing thousands of convicted criminals into the community. So many rumors mounted about cost overruns and security that then Governor of New York Franklin D. Roosevelt soon arrived at the site to vouch for the project's safety and cost-effectiveness. Work on the new prison continued for 3 years at a strenuous pace, sometimes even into the night. The effort paid off, and in early 1931, Cell Block A was ready. Its 500 cells were stacked 3 stories high. That summer, the first inmates arrived at Attica. The population of the new prison quickly grew to reflect the number and type of crimes being committed during the 1930s.
One of the biggest was car thievery. Some of these fellas just couldn't walk by a shiny car. But those fellas done their time here, never give you much trouble. Then, of course, you had rape artists and, sex bandits.
Frank Russo, age 39, came to Attica in 1937 to serve a 20-year to life sentence for raping a woman in Brooklyn. Frank Rosa was transferred from Auburn Prison, where he was serving 20 years for sodomy. The prison also received New York's most gruesome murderers. Men like James Fink, who had been sentenced to life for killing his wife and daughter, then setting their home on fire. Thieves, killers, sex offenders. Even as the doors swung closed on the first prisoners in 1931, Attica had established a legacy as the end of the line for the worst of the worst. The official opening of New York's Attica State Prison came with the Depression era in full swing and brought with it the prospect of new jobs. 120 guards were to be hired at salaries that began at $1,800 per year. Most had never seen the inside of a prison before.
I was impressed by the tremendous height of the walls. The gray structure loomed like a fortress. And once we got through the front gate, there was 24 of us. It was a whole new ball game. It was different, and I was totally not prepared for what type of work I was going to be doing.
While New York's Clinton and Auburn prisons had endured a wave of inmate riots due to overcrowding, the 55-acre prison in Attica was thought to be riot-proof, a belief that for years would go unchallenged.
We enjoyed the jobs. We all had...
Harold Leslie joined the guard staff in 1938.
Each block had their own parties, and we had softball teams. We played other institutions. I know because I pitched for the guards on fast pitch here. And it was quite nice.
Attica's first guards were assisted by an unofficial mascot, a police dog named Castor. Still, he was no substitute for the watchful eyes of men.
There'd be high chairs on the 3 walls. And the officer would go and sit in a chair and just sit there and watch. And if he seen anything happen, he'd just take his club and hit it against the wall behind him. And the others would look and see what was going on. He could point to it.
But there have always been occasions when the guard's club was used for more than a warning.
When you start, you're given a baton or a billy club. Of course, you cannot have a weapon like a gun, or inmates could take it from you. And a lot of times you have to use that. There are times when you have to hit an inmate with it, or other times it's just used to some type of a chokehold or a restraining device.
Most inmates could be controlled through less physical means. A grade system granted better treatment to those who behaved. There was a punishment for nearly every infraction, no matter how minor. Joseph Klein, a murderer serving 20 years to life, lost his movie privileges in 1938 for refusing to take a shower.
We had first grade inmates, second grade inmates, and third grade inmates. And they would lose privileges on each one. Now, if they got a third grade, they didn't get packages, or they only got a visit with permission from the warden.
Talking in line earned the inmate a downgrade. Talking in the mess hall, another.
And fighting in the mess hall, you automatically went to the box. I know I got my nose broke once breaking up a fight in the mess hall.
Attica's strict disciplinary system was essential to keep order. The prison was, in effect, a self-sufficient walled city that contained a farm, a hospital, a textile factory, and a tailor shop. The power plant housed 3 steam-driven generators to operate electric lights that lit up the yard at night. An advanced electrical gun detector was installed to screen prisoners returning from work outside the walls. A state-of-the-art communication system that included telephones and loudspeakers was said to reach every ear inside. Motorized gates led in and out of the main building, and the cells and bars were constructed of tool-proof steel. Cell doors were centrally controlled in each block by the Van Dorn automatic locking system. It was state-of-the-art in 1930 and remains in use today.
It kept the officers from walking down the gallery with the key in his hand, unlocking each cell by itself. And it kept the officer away from the inmates when they were all on the gallery. And you had control. You could tell which cell was open and which one was closed just by looking at the box.
The prison's designers also included devices called gas bombs in areas where inmates normally congregated. They were intended to release tear gas in response to a disturbance.
Well, it looked like a little black ball on the side of the wall around the mess hall and around the auditorium. And there was a booth set in the back of the auditorium with controls in it for if anything happened in there, the officer in the booth would just hit a button and the gas would go off. Everybody knew it was there, and nobody wanted to use it, to tell you the truth. You were in it with the inmate, you were going to sniff gas too.
William Hunt, the prison's first warden, had come to Attica from New York's Great Meadow Penitentiary. He authorized the use of the gas bombs for the first time on Christmas Day, 1932, to quell a scuffle in the cafeteria. More than 400 inmates still assemble in the mess hall at each meal. It remains a flashpoint for violence, one that continues to plague prison officials.
We've had some problems there a couple of years ago where a number of officers were assaulted. The chemical agents was used. I went through the area probably within a half an hour, and I didn't even get into the mess hall. I got down a quarter, and you couldn't see. I mean, my eyes just widened up and closed up. It's extremely effective.
Unit 9 to Attica Base, Battle 2 gas is secure.
Attica Unit 6 to Attica Base. PMS gas is secured.
As an alternative to lethal force, chemical tear gas remains Attica's most effective instrument of control.
We have chemical agents that are used or there to be used to restrain inmates, to keep them from harming each other or causing property damage. And they're very effective if used properly, and it's a very humane method. But that is really better than getting a club over the head.
Today, computer-activated gas pods administer the chemical agents in the event of an inmate disturbance. The pods are clustered in one of the most sensitive areas of the prison, a junction nicknamed Times Square. This is the crossroads for Attica's 2,500 maximum security inmates. It provides access to all areas inside the fortress.
Times Square is an area that where all the movement goes through that particular area, and that's where you're controlled. I mean, if you're going from A block to the mess hall, or if you're going to any of the program areas, it all comes through that area, and it has to be a controlled point. And if that breaks down, then they could spread through the rest of the facility.
The gas system in Times Square is manned around the clock to ensure that no one steps out of line. But the automated system cannot reach every area. As a last resort, guards equipped with shoulder-launched tear gas grenades routinely patrol the corridors. It is a tradition that was introduced in the 1940s when the guns were added to the prison's armory. Around that same time, Attica recorded its first escape. In 1943, 24-year-old inmate Andrew Cleveland, who was serving 10 years for burglary, darted into the woods while working in the gravel pit outside the prison. He was captured an hour later. That 60 minutes of freedom earned Cleveland 10 more years behind the gray walls of Attica. The humane control of convicted criminals, that is the objective inside the walls of Attica. More than half of its 2,500 inmates are serving life sentences for murder. No one walks, talks, or eats without permission. Life is a cell, a tray of food, and a fading memory of freedom. Michael Borres has been here more than 20 years.
What did I do? I'm convicted of second-degree murder. And it was a robbery murder. And I was involved, you know. I made a bad decision. And that decision cost me 22 years of my life. You know.
Oh, my name is Grant Minor, number 81A2644.
Grant Minor is serving 25 years to life for a robbery murder. He has been in Attica for 18 years.
The person wasn't supposed to die. It's just one of those things that happen. And getting caught up in the spur of the moment, trying to get away, try to cover it up, it's too late, you know. And when I realized what happened, I know for a fact that we didn't leave the person dead.
Inside the 6 by 9 foot cells of Attica, there has always been plenty of time for self-reflection and regret.
My name is Roger Paul Weiser, 95B742.
Roger Weiser is 61 years old. He has been in and out of Attica since 1968. He is currently serving 7 years for assault and domestic violence.
So I can sell. That's a tough one. Well, I mean, it's like anywhere else. You adjust to it. I'm institutionalized. I've been in prison over 4 years of my life.
My name is Richard Mainprize, 84C 434.
Richard Mainprize is serving 25 years to life for murder.
Attica doesn't generate a lot of hope in a person's life. It's a tough thing to do time. But when you're cut off so thoroughly from the outside, people just get angry.
Lonely. And you try to escape any way you can by maybe screaming out the cell, talking out the cell, singing in the cell, anything to take your mind away from being in the cell.
Isolated. You can even sort of like an animal, you know, in a cage, you know, people passing by, looking in. The only time you open it is when you come out to eat or work or something like that, but it's not a pleasant place.
Ellis Stokely was convicted of felony murder in 1976 and sentenced to life. He has been in Attica 23 years.
You know, sometimes you think about death and you kind of wonder what would it be like to not be around anymore. And this place kind of like lets you see that and still be alive.
Despair has always been part of life in Attica. But during the 1940s and 50s, Attica earned the reputation as one of New York's model prisons. Its inmates largely cooperated with their jailers. Samuel Melville quietly served a year for arson and possession of a bomb in New York City. Arthur Gould, a petty thief from Rochester, had a 2-month sentence for stealing tools.
Man was a robber, a bank robber, something like that. That was his job. He got caught, he did his time, he went back out, he did it over again. But it was a whole different breed of men. They were crooks, and they took what they got, and they didn't fight it, they just went along with it.
One of Attica's most notorious professional crooks arrived in 1952. His name was Willie Sutton. An accomplished safecracker and bank robber, Sutton stole from the rich and kept it. He robbed nearly 100 banks during a career which began in the 1920s and lasted for 30 years. The colorful thief often wore makeup and disguises during his holdups, a practice that earned him the nickname Willie the Actor. Sutton had several stays behind bars, highlighted by an escape from Sing Sing in 1933 and another escape in 1945 from Eastern State Prison in Philadelphia. Sutton's final arrest followed a nationwide manhunt in 1952. At his trial, he was convicted of just one crime: illegal firearms possession. That day, the paddy wagon whisked him away from court and took him to Attica.
Willie locked an A-block on that company right along that wall over there. Locked in 2-cell. Gentleman bank robber. Got caught, knew it. Willie's cell got frisked twice a week because he was known to be an escape artist. No trouble at all, worked in the laundry.
He used to do the pressing of the warden's shirts. The warden had his laundry done there. I frisked him when he came in from Sing Sing. They sent me down to frisk him.
Sutton was released from Attica in 1969, a free man. He died in Florida in 1980 at the age of 79. Sutton's contemporaries at Attica were less well known, but no less villainous. Joseph Donahue was serving 35 years to life for shooting a man in a New York City park. Rudolph Santabello, a 22-year-old hoodlum, was serving a life sentence for the 1950 murder of a Bronx policeman. The 1960s marked a time of change inside Attica, a change for the worse. It reflected America's war on drugs and the men sent to prison for narcotics crimes. Martin Sustry was serving 10 years for selling drugs in his New York City bookstore. Francois Scalia, popularly known as the French Connection, was sent to Attica in 1963 as a result of the largest heroin bust in New York City history. To the outside world, such high-profile convictions helped to bolster the illusion that all was well inside Attica, that the inmates were under control. But by 1970, the staff at Attica knew that trouble was brewing.
When we started putting people in jail for 1 or 2 marijuana cigarettes, that's when we started getting in trouble. Because we started getting a different class of people that figured they weren't supposed to be in jail for what they did.
You could see a change in the demeanor of these men. I don't know, I'm not a penologist, and I don't know what it was, but they all felt like they were being held here illegally or something.
In August of 1971, Black Panther leader George Jackson was killed by the guard staff at California's San Quentin prison during an alleged escape attempt. 2 days later, as they filed in for the morning meal, Attica's inmates staged a chilling silent protest in solidarity with the slain black leader and fellow prisoner.
Everybody just came in and they didn't take any food or anything, and they just sat down. It was the first time that I ever experienced that kind of a silence in a mess hall that held over 500 inmates. It was absolutely silent.
The protest was an ominous demonstration to prison officials that the inmates had the ability to organize. What happened next came with little warning and rocked the nation with the most terrifying images of killing and brutality ever seen in an American prison. By the 1970s, Attica State Prison was a reflection of the racial tensions that were gripping America as a whole. Its inmates were largely black and Hispanic. Most came from the inner city. Attica's guards, on the other hand, were predominantly white and had come from the town of Attica and the rural countryside surrounding it. The animosity between prisoners and guards grew as prison administrators severely limited the inmates' access to mail, newspapers, phone calls, even showers and toilet paper. Add to this overcrowding, and Attica became a bubbling cauldron.
The night before the riot, this inmate told me that tomorrow we'll be wearing your shirts. What else could it be but saying that they're going to take over this place, take over the officers, take prisoners.
It began as a minor scuffle between two prisoners. Then word spread that guards had put the two in solitary confinement. On September 9th, 1971, Attica boiled over. It was 9 a.m. in A corridor, just after the morning meal, a time when the inmates were normally marched off to the recreation yard.
Right now we're walking up A corridor towards Times Square. As history says, it was the inmates who would come down from chow and they would go out into the yard, which is A corridor, and this is A yard door right here. The inmates would go out into the yard after their meal. The inmates refused to go out in the yard, and at that point they turned and headed back towards Times Square.
At that time, the corridor leading to Times Square, the heart of the prison compound, had no gas system. It was controlled only by an aging iron gate. When a crush of inmates challenged the gate, a crucial bolt gave way, and all hell broke loose. Rioting prisoners surged through the passageway, attacking guards and taking 29 of them hostage. They quickly gained control of Cell Block D, its recreation yard, and the catwalk above it.
Inside the walls and inside D yard, the inmates had crudely fashioned weapons. They also had gained possession of a couple of gas guns.
Power! Unity!
They were screaming and hollering that one of the pigs is bleeding, and if he dies, the blood is going to be on your hands. We've got him here.
The inmates allowed the injured guard to be removed on a stretcher.
And I'll never forget seeing he had two huge gashes on his forehead, and then we took him down to the front, and shortly after they took him to the hospital in an ambulance, and he died later.
Officer John Stockholm was clubbed on the head with his own baton. He was taken hostage and dragged bleeding and semi-conscious into D Block.
I was scared to death. I was scared to death. We didn't shit, shave, or shower for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. I mean, you didn't move from your little area that you were in. There was not much movement. The one thing I will say that if we asked for it, we asked for cigarettes, they would give us whatever brand we were smoking. But at different times, especially at night, was the longest time of the day because it seemed to last forever and you just were completely uncomfortable. But there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it.
The prisoners demanded their own negotiating committee. It was a diverse group that included radical lawyer William Kunstler, Black Panther leader Bobby Seale, and journalist Tom Wicker of the New York Times.
Is it 37? Whatever the latest figure are.
Everybody seemed to think that the first thing that we ought to do was to go in and talk to the inmates. All we were hearing was from the prison officials. So we did that, and we went in and talked to the inmates that night, and we got an earful in which they unloaded their complaints on us, and made an impression on many people, including me, that they did have some legitimate grievances.
You all know what's happened here?
The inmates drafted a list of demands that they insisted be met before they released their hostages.
In view of the fact now that...
Among other things, they demanded more than one shower a week and more than one telephone call home a week and less pork on the menu and other things of that kind that may not seem to the general public to be very serious. But if you're in a place, say, for 10 years and you're there day after day and these things apply, then they are serious.
Additional facts which...
By the fourth day of the siege, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller authorized the use of state troopers to retake the prison.
I think Governor Rockefeller felt that if he didn't do something at that point, 3 or 4 days into the revolt, if he waited another week or another 2 weeks, maybe nothing would happen, but he would be criticized heavily for being soft on crime, for not really cracking down on these murderers, rapists, and thieves, you know.
Outside, officials cut off the prison's power in preparation for the final showdown. Inside, the hostages were blindfolded and moved onto the catwalk above D Yard.
They come up, as I come up the steps, then we come out, and then they took me, the best of my knowledge, I ended up over into this area here, and I was given a stool to sit on, and then the inmate said to me, well, you got any last requests, because it's going to be over shortly. So I asked him, I said, well, if you got a cigarette, I'd enjoy a cigarette. So he gave me a cigarette, and for some reason he untied my hands, and he said, well, if you make any fast moves, you're dead.
Moments later, Stockholm heard the sound of a helicopter rise from the parking lot and hover overhead.
And they stood us up and tilted our heads back and put a sharp, I assume, a shank or knife to our throat, to my throat anyways. And then the helicopter disappeared. I mean, there was no more sound. So everybody kind of, I got the feeling that everybody relaxed because he had me sit back down, and then all of a sudden another helicopter, and then everything started happening.
From the second helicopter, a choking cloud of tear gas poured down onto the chaos below. Riflemen took up positions in the windows and on the roofs of A and C blocks. They peered through their gas masks at the inmates on the catwalks and in the yard. The blindfolded hostages waited, listened, and prayed as the siege of Attica turned into a nightmare. September 13th, 1971, day 4 of the siege. A light rain had begun to fall on Attica State Prison as a helicopter codenamed Jackpot 1 hovered over the riot scene. Its mission was to spill tear gas onto the 1,500 prisoners and hostages below. State troopers took aim with rifles and waited for any sudden movement. As the gas poured down, inmates and hostages on the catwalks instinctively dropped to the cement. A single shot rang out from a rooftop post. Then a second. Then a thunder. Inmate Roger Weiser was in a part of the prison that was cut off from the riot. His cell overlooked D Yard.
All I saw was just the shooting. You know, it was just a massive, I mean, it was just like a Western movie where there's just a whole barrage of gunfire.
We could see out our windows bodies and not necessarily dead bodies, but wounded and so forth being brought out to that grassy space between the administration building and the walls.
Assault units in gas masks and riot gear moved out onto the catwalks and joined in the shooting.
It sounded like pop, 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 gunfire coming from different, all over. It was coming from over this way. I really can't say because I'm laying on the ground and I can see underneath the bottom of my mask and I could see underneath that I could see the B block side. So I knew I was in B block. I was over here. And I'm thinking to myself, do I go, slide off and drop into the yard? Well, I decided to stay right where I was. And I could feel the chips, cement chips and stuff hitting my body. And like this over here now is one of the bullet holes. And then there's also some other ones on the other side over here.
6 minutes after Jackpot 1 had dropped its load of tear gas over Attica's D yard, the firing stopped. Inmates lay in the mud, wounded and choking. Most had not resisted the attack. The rest surrendered when they were ordered to.
Do not harm the hostages. Surrender peacefully. You will not be harmed.
In prison jargon, the yard was once again secure. But it had been a massacre. 85 inmates had gunshot wounds. 39 men were dead or bleeding to death. Of those killed, 10 had been hostages. Initial reports claimed they had been murdered by prisoners.
They were killed by gunfire and not by inmates slitting their throats. And that became a very disputed point because as soon as the yard was retaken, the state of New York announced a bald-faced, cold-blooded, callous lie that the hostages had been killed by the inmates. It was not true, and it took 2 or 3 days for the medical examiner's report to catch up to that lie and for the truth to be published.
The news fueled protesters across the country who rallied for prison reform, inmates' rights, and the end of America's so-called racist regime. Attica became their battle cry.
Attica's blood on Rockefeller's hand.
The hysteria was bolstered by popular figures like John Lennon, who performed on national television with his wife Yoko Ono to rally viewers behind the movement that had been spawned at Attica. Their song urged nothing short of a revolution against Rockefeller and the American system of justice. Were the voices of protest heard by Attica's officials? Many believe they were and point to the improvements that have been made at the prison since the uprising. D Block, the scene of the riot, was rebuilt in 1977 as the Honor Block. A curious distinction, considering the inmates here are serving life sentences for the most capital of crimes. Still, prisoners housed here are allowed to cook their own meals in a quiet setting and live in larger cells. They are permitted to decorate according to their tastes. A new vocational training school offers classes and hope for those who want to improve themselves. The prison's library now offers a diverse selection of newspapers and periodicals. But during this time of rebuilding and reform, Attica did not go soft. In fact, the prison received some of its most chilling criminals. David Berkowitz, a 24-year-old postal employee, was one of the most feared serial killers in history. During a year-long reign of terror, the city of New York was gripped in fear as he stalked his young female victims after dark and brutally shot them. In a series of bizarre letters he wrote to police, Berkowitz called himself the Son of Sam. In 1979, he arrived at Attica convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to more than 300 years behind bars.
He, with his notorious, with the name and everything, they put him in segregation, special housing. And so he's away from all the other inmates this is general population basically, so they keep him segregated.
Berkowitz was eventually transferred to Sullivan State Prison in Fallsburg, New York. In 1980, after a long absence from the pop music scene, John Lennon again entered the recording studio. But on December 8th, as he returned to his New York City apartment, a lone figure stepped from the shadows and fired 4 pistol shots. Within hours, the world heard the tragic news. John Lennon was dead. His killer was a troubled young man named Mark David Chapman. When asked why he murdered Lennon, Chapman replied, "I understood the words, but I didn't understand the meaning." In a strange twist, Chapman was sent to the very prison that Lennon had attacked in song 10 years earlier. At that time, Lennon had urged jail for the judges and freedom for prisoners, whose only needs were for love and care. Chapman received 20 years to life and was ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. Today, he lives in the prison's special housing unit, where high-risk inmates and troublemakers are segregated from the general population.
If we were to put him in population, I don't think that he probably would do very well. Somebody could possibly want to harm him, to be the man that took care of the man that took care of Lennon type thing. And he's not a physically built individual. He's pleasant, he's very religious now.
Today, Attica stands as a grim reminder of some of the darkest days in the history of penology. It also points to what prisoners can expect in the future.
I believe the future of the place probably is pretty much what you see today. We do have a very, very difficult inmate to manage. A lot of, I believe there's approximately 600, maybe 650 that are doing life sentences. Any crime that you can imagine, they're here. There are probably over 200 escape risks in this facility. It's a tough facility. But again, you know, it runs smoothly.
If I was an inmate, I would think that living in Attica would be the pits, the bottom of the barrel of any place I could think of, with one exception. I do know that I'm going to be pretty secure if I want to be. If I behave myself, and I know I'm going to be fed decent meals that I can live on, and I know I'm going to be offered programs that I can take advantage of if I want.
Still, one question hangs above this legendary prison. Could there ever be another riot like the one that rocked its foundation in 1971?
Well, you hope not. You hope that there's enough mechanisms in place to prevent something like that.
For now, most of Attica's 2,500 inmates struggle peacefully to find dignity behind its iron bars and concrete walls. And the prison staff continues its constant vigil to maintain control.